There's a right way and a wrong way to implement a splash screen in Flutter. The splash screen isn't a typical Flutter screen. In this video, we'll use the Flutter native splash package to set up native iOS and Android splash screens for your Flutter project the right way. We'll cover all the important settings so you can get up and running quickly. To begin with, let's clarify something I mentioned just a few seconds ago. A splash screen is not simply the first screen that's shown in your app. These are native iOS and Android screens that are implemented outside of the Flutter environment. When a Flutter app is launched on a smartphone, it takes a moment for the Flutter framework to load. Because the framework is still loading, it is not possible to use a screen built within Flutter as a splash screen. However, by implementing a native splash screen, it can be shown immediately without delay since it was built outside of Flutter. In fact, Apple requires this for all iOS apps. To set up our splash screen, we first need to install the Flutter native splash package. Next, we define a configuration. This is where we specify colors, images, and other settings for the splash screen. Finally, we generate the splash screens based on the configuration. Steps 2 and 3 can be repeated if any updates are needed. Here we have a very basic Flutter project that will run in an iPhone simulator. The app consists of a main.dart file, which displays a centered text widget. I've also created an assets folder, which contains images that will be used when building our screens. I'll go ahead and run the app so we can see what happens when it starts. Right now, there is no splash screen. When the app is launched, a white screen is shown while the Flutter framework loads. It's possible to build native splash screens for Android and iOS from scratch using Flutter, but there's a much easier way. We can use the Flutter native splash package. It does most of the heavy lifting and only requires some basic configuration. From the Installing tab, I'll copy the install command and then run it in a terminal window to download the package. All right, that looks good. After installing the package, we're ready to configure our splash screens. This can be done in the pubspec.yaml file, or we can create a separate YAML file in the project root directory. I'm going to create a separate file since this feels like a more intuitive place to store this information. You can name the file whatever you'd like. Inside the file, we'll create a key named Flutter Native Splash. The first thing we'll do is specify the platforms that we'd like to support. This is optional, but if you leave it blank, Flutter Native Splash will generate screens for Android, iOS, and web. The simplest property we can define is a background color. This is the bare minimum required to create a splash screen. To set a background color, we define the color property and provide a hex value. I'll go with a light blue. After saving the file, I'll generate the splash screen. We can do this with the Flutter native splash create command. Because I've chosen to store my config in a standalone YAML file instead of pubspec.yaml, I need to provide the path flag. If you put your config in pubspec.yaml, then you don't need to include the path. All right, so we can see that a number of files were generated. To preview our splash screen, we can't simply use the hot reload or restart features that Flutter provides. It's a little bit of a hassle, but I found that even stopping the app and rebuilding it with the run command can cause some issues. In specific, if there's an existing splash screen and changes are made, the older values aren't always cleared. To get around this, I quit the simulator, reopen it, then rebuild the app with the run command. You might not need to do this on your machine, but if you do run into a similar issue, this workaround should solve it for you. Now when we run our app, we see a light blue splash screen. Sometimes splash screens are easily missed. I've paused the screen so that you'll be able to see it. Let's make a few more customizations to our splash screen. Instead of a background color, let's use a background image. While we're at it, let's add a logo and a branding image. Because we've changed the configuration, we need to regenerate our splash screens. Once again, we'll kill the simulator, restart it, then rebuild the app. Now our splash screens display a gradient instead of a background color, and we also see a logo and branding image. In this example, the following image dimensions were used. The background image is based on the largest iPhone screen dimensions. I'd recommend this image size if you're planning to use a background image. For the logo and branding images, you can customize these as needed. but as a guideline, I've provided values for these as well. The configuration we've defined so far will work for iOS and older versions of Android. Starting in Android 12, splash screens are handled a bit differently. And as a result, we need to specify additional configuration options in our YAML file. Let's boot our app on a simulator running Android 13. You'll notice that the background image, logo, and branding images did not appear. To get this working, we'll add an Android 12 configuration section in the YAML file. We can specify a background color, but the background image property is not supported in newer versions of Android. For the logo, I'm using a different image file because Android has specific requirements. We'll cover the exact dimensions shortly. I'm also using a different branding image. After saving the config file, we'll regenerate the splash screens. Then we'll quit and reopen the emulator. And finally, we'll build the app. Now our splash screen is working in Android as well. As mentioned, Android logos or icon images have specific requirements. For logos without a background, the image should be 1152 by 1152, and the logo itself should fit in a 768 by 768 circle. For logos with a background, the image should be 960 by 960, and the logo should fit in a 640 by 640 circle. Flutter Native Splash has built-in support for dark mode. This is based on your operating system setting and not an app-level setting. So if your app is set to dark mode and you've defined dark-themed variants of your splash screen assets, then these will be used. Let's set up a dark mode background, logo, and branding image for iOS. This time before building our app, I'll switch to dark mode in the iOS emulator using the Command-Shift-A shortcut. Now when we run the app, we should see a dark background, logo, and branding image. All right, that looks great. To set this up for Android 12 or later, we can specify dark options for the background color, logo image, and branding image within the Android 12 configuration section. By default, the splash screen will be removed when Flutter has drawn the first frame. However, we can configure the splash screen to continue showing up during app initialization. This is done with the preserve and remove methods provided by Flutter Native Splash. To demonstrate this, we can set a 3-second delay during the init state method. It makes sense to do this if you have an app initialization process that is time-consuming. However, you should not do this to display the splash screen needlessly. This is a bad user experience. First, we'll convert the My App widget to a stateful widget because we'll need access to the init state method. Next, we'll import Flutter native splash.dart so we have access to the preserve and remove methods. Then we'll ensure the Flutter framework is loaded with the ensure initialized method. At this point, we can call the preserve method. This basically says keep showing the splash screen until the remove method is called. We'll define the init state method that will get called when run app calls the My App widget. We'll also define an async method named initialization that will be responsible for calling the remove method after the time delay. And finally, the initialization method is called from the init state method. Let's build the app one more time. This time the splash screen appears along with a 3-second pause. In the console, you'll notice the pause between the pausing and unpausing print statements being logged. While setting this package up is easier than implementing a native splash screen manually, it does have some limitations. The Flutter native splash package does not have support for video, animations, interactivity, and dynamic data. That said, the vast majority of splash screens, even ones used by some of the most popular apps, are quite simple and can be implemented using the native splash screen package. Well, that about does it for this video. I hope you consider using this package. Until next time.